When you start your garden plants from seed, you have many options for the pots, maybe too many options. Join me today as I discuss the question, does the size of the pot really matter? Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and I start a lot of plants from seed. In fact, most of the plants in my landscape and just about all the plants in my vegetable garden, I start from seed. And these are just some of the many pots I use in that process. Some I use for sowing the seeds, some I use for transplanting the seedlings before they go outside. And there's a lot of different sizes. So when we discuss the question, does size matter? Well, yes and no. One of the most common questions I get is, why can't I just start a seed in the big pot? Why do I need to begin in the small pot? Well, there are 5 factors that I look at when I determine which pot I'm going to use to start my seeds. Right now, I have more than 300 seeds sown on these light shelves. By growing in these 72 cell flats, I can grow 300 plants in a relatively small space. And that's the first factor I consider. How much space do I have to grow my plants? Imagine how much space it would take if I sowed one seed in a pot this size. 300 of these pots would fill this room. I don't have that much space. That's a big reason why I'm starting in the smaller pots first. If you have the space, or you're not starting 300 plants, you can easily start in a bigger pot. Or maybe start in a smaller pot just to get the plants going. And it's right at the beginning, when I'm just getting the plants going, that I'm most concerned about wasting space. In this flat, I've sown some onion seeds, older seeds, so I was a little concerned about the germination rate. So I sowed a number of seeds in each of these cells. And in some of the cells, I've got some pretty good germination. But in other cells, I have absolutely no germination. And then in other cells, maybe only 1 or 2 of the plants germinated and are growing. If I have little or no germination in a little cell or pot that size, I really haven't wasted much space. I still have dozens or hundreds of other plants in this shelf system. The lights are important to keep the seedlings growing, and they'll keep growing even with the loss of a few of the plants. But in a big space, if I'm growing in big pots, well, I've actually wasted a lot of space that maybe could be used for something else. And that's why I start small, because I do have space with other lights that are reserved for something else, the bigger plants. And so the second factor is the time involved with growing the plants. I'm growing a number of different peppers in this flat, and the germination rates between the different seeds are actually quite diverse. Some are growing pretty quickly, and others, particularly some of these hot peppers, have yet to germinate. The timing involved from the seed starting to the transplanting is going to vary by plant. These pepper plants are typically started 10 to 12 weeks before transplanting outside once the soil is warm enough. But a seed like tomato might only be started 6 to 8 weeks before putting outside. So I can limit all of my focus into this tower until these plants are ready to move to another set of lights. And I practice a conveyor belt concept with my seed starting, germination, and seedling growth until the plants go outside. Everything is growing in this tower. When it's big enough, I'll transplant it to a bigger pot, and more on this in a second. And then I'll put this pot under a new section of lights. As I free up the space on this initial grow tower, now I can put in a new flat of seeds or new pots, depending on what kind of plant I'm going to be growing. So the tomato seeds will be germinating under these lights when the pepper plants are growing under these lights. It all depends on how fast the plant is growing. And you can see that with some of these flowers that I'm growing. The Heliopsis and the blue sage in the background are going to be ready for transplanting long before the palm sedge or the prairie dropseed that's just starting to sprout. These firecracker vines will be going into new pots pretty soon. And time plays a factor in determining which of these pots I'm going to use when I transplant out of these cells. I think about how big the plant is going to grow while I have it indoors under lights. And so for some plants, maybe an herb that is going to grow quite slowly, I might put it in a small pot. But for a flower like the firecracker vine that you already saw is growing very quickly, well, I'll probably put it into one of these bigger pots because the plant is going to need the extra space to grow. And I also think about how long I'm going to have it indoors. Last year, I grew lavender from seed. It takes a very long time to grow, and I actually had those plants indoors for most of a year. Well, I transplanted into these bigger pots, kept them under lights the entire time, and then the following year, when I transplanted the lavender into my garden, I had some pretty good sized plants. It really doesn't matter whether it's a square or a round pot. The size really does need to match with the plant and how much you expect the size of the plant to grow. And so you might be thinking, if I know that this is going to be the final size for the plant, why don't I just go ahead and start the seeds in these small containers to begin with? Well, now the third factor comes into play, and that's nutrition. All of these seeds were started in a seed starter mix, and I showed in a recent video how I make my seed starter mix. It's primarily peat moss and perlite, almost no nutrition for the plants. So I need to get out of this low nutrition environment and go into an environment where the plants can actually grow. And so in these pots, I'll be filling them with a potting mix or a potting soil that has compost and worm castings and fertilizers to help support the growth of the plant. I need to transplant out of this into this. Now, I could go ahead and fill these pots with that potting mix, sow the seeds in them, and just grow from this point forward with no other transplanting. This is another aspect of time. If you don't have a lot of time that you have to worry about with the transplanting, go ahead and start in a pot with the potting soil. But my experience has shown that the seeds will germinate better and the seedlings get a better start with a mix like this than they would in a potting mix. This is one of those factors that you'll have to decide for yourself. And I encourage that you try both the seed starter mix and a potting soil mix and see how the seeds grow that you're starting. You could try a blend to save time and get the best of both worlds, and that's to take a smaller pot, fill the bottom portion with the potting mix, the top portion with the seed starter mix, and then just set this under lights, let the plant grow, and transplant it outside when you want to. That's definitely a viable option. But because I'm starting so many plants under the lights in this system, I have the time, and I'm willing to go ahead and do the transplanting for the nutrient values. About now, you might be thinking about what cost is involved by doing all this transplanting. And as you can see here, I have a lot of pots. This is just a portion of what I have. Cost is the fourth factor that I consider in determining what size pot I'm going to use and how I move forward with the transplanting process. Because every time I transplant, well, that means I need at least 2 pots for each of those seedlings. I need the pot that I started growing in, and then I need the pot that I'm going to continue growing in. Because this is the process I use, I've invested in the pots for this process. If you're not doing nearly the number of plants, or you're concerned about the cost, well, there are other options. I also transplant into these yogurt cups or into these solo cups, and I reuse everything to try to keep the cost down. I like to transplant tomato plants at least twice because I'm doing a lot of tomato plants, and using that conveyor belt system, I'll move them into first a pot about this size, about a 3-inch pot, and beyond that I'll move to a bigger pot, like a 4-inch pot, and this might be what I end up with before I take them outside. Those are all important factors. With a tomato or any other plant, yes, I could go ahead and start it in a pot this size using the potting mix to cut down on the cost involved. Again, because of the space involved, if I start in these bigger pots, well, I need more lights to cover the entire space until those seeds have germinated and started sprouting. So I don't have as many lights as I might otherwise have if I were just growing in the big pots. I can cut down on some of my costs by doing the conveyor belt with fewer lights and have more pots in the process. The fifth factor is water. How much water is involved in the process? When I start in a cell like this that's covered with a humidity dome, I only water the first time I sow these seeds, and then there may be a week or 2 with no further watering. Using the humidity domes over these flats is very easy for me. It helps keep the humidity levels pretty consistent and the soil moist so that those seeds germinate and begin growing. Well, if you're growing in big pots, how are you going to cover these to help hold that humidity in, especially if it's in a big space? You might need to mist or water more often to keep that soil moist so that those seeds germinate. Big reason why I like starting this way first. If you do any research into what size pot you should start your seeds in, you'll probably see that a big reason that you shouldn't start seeds in a big pot is because of the water concerns. When you have this big pot filled with soil, the reasoning goes that it holds water better. And so as you water to keep the top moist as that plant grows, you're going to saturate all the soil within, which is going to drown the roots. It's going to run out all the oxygen and replace it with water. Well, I can almost see the reasoning for that, but I think that becomes a question of how you water and whether you're over watering, because there are many plant growers that are starting in big pots like this. Instead, I'm looking at how much water is needed for the plant during its specific growth phases. And it's easier for me to determine how much water that plant needs when it's growing in a smaller pot than trying to figure out the root to soil ratio, as some of those sources are more concerned with. I keep the plant growing in the size pot that's appropriate for its size. And as the plant grows, then I'll put it into a bigger pot or put it outside if it's the appropriate time to do that. To get a basic idea of the size of the pot to match for the specific growth of the plant, think about what you're buying at a nursery or a big box store. A small to medium pot like this corresponds usually with a 6 or 8 inch tall tomato plant. or pepper plant. If you're buying a big tomato plant, well, it's probably in a bigger pot. The professional growers are almost always starting in the small cells and then transplanting into the bigger pots. What they know, and what I've found from experience, is that as the plant grows, if you keep it in a small pot, the plant is going to stay small. So to get more growth out of your plant, you need to put it into a bigger pot. Go to the nursery, look around. Go to a greenhouse, if you can find it, a professional greenhouse, and see how they're growing. And what you'll see is a conveyor belt system, much like what I do, going from smaller pots to bigger pots until they get to the final size that they're after, the size that's going to go out in the garden. You can follow that same process. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.